stuff.
Okay. And now, if Matt was here, he'd say in a completely different direction. John Lennon and Yoko Ono. The album released, I believe it was 2 weeks before, unfortunately, John Lennon was shot in New York City and passed away. So many people think of this as a very sad album, for understandable reasons. But I'll give a little bit of a bio of where John Lennon and Yoko Ono are at, because I think it's extremely important to have a little bit of context to understand this album, because thematically it really pops out. But before I get there, any initial thoughts, Josh, before I go into bio mode?
Well, I can't remember if I said this during our discussion of one of the other two albums, solo albums, or maybe just in general with the Beatles going solo. But, I think there was this impression by me, or maybe the public at large, that they were making, that Lennon and Ono were making, challenging music, or like experimental in some respects, and it may be different than what the Beatles were doing, but the talent and essence of all of the Beatles in their solo efforts is there, and their own kind of their contribution to the Beatles is highlighted in their solo work, if that makes sense. What made John Lennon special as a contributing member of the Beatles is highlighted and singled out in his solo work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think John Lennon was trying to be more challenging than the other ones, and I think it was just in the solo career, Paul McCartney became the melody-driven guy that he always would have been, and George Harrison kind of found his melodies quicker too. Mm-hmm. Lennon knew his way around melody too, but he consciously fought that a little bit. With that being said, I don't think this is the album where he leaned into that more. I consider this to be about as straight ahead as Yoko Ono possibly can play it.
Absolutely.
I don't think I've ever heard anything more straight ahead from her. Well, and it's all relative, but for her, this is mainstream pop, and certainly John Lennon is writing pop songs on this album too.
Yes.
But we'll save a little bit of the take, because I think you and I might see some of the same things, but I kind of want to give a little bit of an overview as to where we're at. So heading into this album, John Lennon had put his musical career on hold since 1975. His son Sean gets born. I always feel for Julian a little bit, right? Like he he gets, John Lennon like finds his purpose in life, right? With Sean, and dumps all his love into him, and Julian's kind of there. There's a very, very good single by Julian Lennon, Much Too Late for Goodbyes, which was his first single in the 80s, that's kind of about his relationship with his dad. And I find it to be a very profound but very sad song that's sort of like he loves his father, right, and yearns for it, but like, he's aware, right? And I saw an interview one time with Sean Lennon where he says he really tries to be aware, because he's aware, right, that he got all the stuff poured into him, and Julian kind of got left to fend for himself a little bit. But anyway, that's a editorial comment from me. Feel free to do that. But he, during this point, is sort of living a domestic life. I think there's a lot of stories of doing research. They always use the analogy of him like baking bread, right? Is like the John Lennon's at home, right? Like doing domestic things, he's not doing Primal Scream anymore, or Turbulent, yes, right? Like he's into there. So this album is designed
out a little bit.
Well, and yes, he's found his peace, right? Like many men who, I guess, full disclosure, Josh and I are both childless individuals. Yes. And so I have heard enough times from guys who have kids that they feel like that's where I won't editorialize. But a lot of guys seem to find what I consider to be things that are universal truths through having kids, and I respect that, right? Like, the larger world, right? Like having responsibility, being selfless, and it seems like John Lennon was not immune, right, to this like drug that is child rearing, with the person he loves. So by this time though, John Lennon is starting to get the itch again, and Yoko is as well. there's a couple different anecdotes that come up quite a bit. One is that in June 1980, John Lennon goes on a sailing trip from Rhode Island to Bermuda. They get into a storm and he ends up having to take the wheel of the ship. And I guess it has one of those things where it's like, because he's able to survive, right? It like gives him confidence and gets a little bit more of like alpha John Lennon, I guess, back. He'd become a little bit betaized, his father. And now he's just like, the guy who was the ornery force of the Beatles, right? I guess comes back a little bit. And also, of course, there's the fragility of life type deal, right? So that's a theme going into this, that he's just sort of like, I feel inspired again. The other thing that comes about quite a bit, and you may have heard this story, Josh, but I have many times, is that Yoko Ono becomes a fan of certain pop music in the late 70s, and turns John Lennon onto it as well. And there's different examples of stuff that really speaks to them. You'll hear like, the Talking Heads, some of the krautrock stuff appeals to them. But the song that always comes up is Rock Lobster by the B-52s, because Lennon and Yoko Ono feel like that's a song that shows that like people were paying attention to like what Yoko was doing, right? And like they feel like there's a lane now, right, where you can take like sort of Yoko stylings, right, and make it palatable for mass consumption. So that's a little bit of the thing. So they decide that they're gonna do a dual album. While they didn't say it, I think it's safe to say that it feels like this is a conversation between the two of them, because it's a Lennon track followed by a Yoko track, track followed, and oftentimes it alternates, and oftentimes if you look at the titles of the songs, they seem to play off of the other, like and thematically, lyrically. I feel like John Lennon is laying questions down, and then Yoko is answering them in her own way. I wouldn't say directly. A lot of times, the titles make you think it's going to be directive, right? Like I think one's like, Yoko, I don't know, and then the other's like, well, then I'm leaving, kind of, or like titles of the song. But then you look at the lyrics, and they're a little bit opaque, right? And so I don't know if like lyrically it totally does it, but you can see a conversation.
Yeah, it kind of like dabbles or like touches on each other. Like a perfect example would be I'm Losing You and I'm Moving On. Those two tracks, they kind of sonically play into one another and sound similar. They're like two sides of the same coin, kind of.
Yeah. And the other thing that comes up quite a bit in it is that John Lennon had heard Paul McCartney's single Coming Up in 1980 and had given a compliment to Paul McCartney, which was rare in the 70s, where he said it was a good piece of work. And he did say that McCartney has said, it is coming from McCartney, so who knows? But I think it's probably true that Lennon had reached out to him and said that, he enjoyed it and was looking forward to recording. And certainly when you see the type of music he creates, you can see that he might have been more in the McCartney-esque frame of mind, I'd say.
Yes,
recording. Yeah. Before we kind of get into what I think is a clear 50s and 60s influence on this album too, let me give, which I don't want to take up too much air, and I'm going to give a little bit more, Josh. Then I'm going to turn it over to you. What happened is Yoko Ono approaches Jack Douglas, who's a pretty famous producer. I think he's probably most known for producing a couple of the big Aerosmith albums of the 70s, and it did Patti Smith, New York Dolls, and stuff like that. So they go there, they go to the Hit Factory, they begin to record. And actually they did so many tracks that they end up doing another album called Milk and Honey that's posthumous for John Lennon, which is sort of the other pieces of this album that are also sort of set up with a combo John Lennon, Yoko Ono piece. Lennon also comes into this wanting new musicians all around him. And he asks Douglas to kind of put together different people who will serve as sort of session players. And he actually brings in two members of Cheap Trick to be musicians, which I thought was pretty interesting. Rick Nielsen, who's probably the guy you think of with Cheap Trick, right? Like the hat, the crazy clothes, right? He's the lead guitarist and the songwriter. And then Bun E. Carlos, who said like Bunny, right? Who's a drummer for Cheap Trick. They're musicians on this. And they are, they originally were playing on I'm Losing You and I'm Moving On, but then they actually don't end up on the album. They get replaced by studio musicians, but they do release the Cheap Trick versions on like an anthology collection for John Lennon. But there's all these different people who are recording. Interestingly enough, like Lennon's famously his record contract expired in 1975 as well. Like he was rushing material, right, to get out of it. And then he was out and he was free and clear. So they actually didn't have a record label at all when they did this. And so they self-financed all of this. They recorded in secret, so no one knew they were doing it. And when they had gotten an album they felt comfortable with, they just called their publicist and they just said, "We're coming back." And then, of course, all the labels are like, "We'd love to sign you, John Lennon, and you too, Yoko Ono." And they end up signing with Geffen Records. And you know what they attribute the reason why Geffen won? Geffen was smart enough to, when he called, ask to speak to Yoko Ono first about her contribution to the album, because he said that he viewed it as a co-album and he wasn't going to release it as John Lennon featuring Yoko Ono. He was going to release it as a dual album. So, which it is, I'd like to say, by the way.
Yeah.
But that's a good record guy, right? You know what I mean? He's aware of, what's going on. So, and then unfortunately, as I mentioned, this was released, and very shortly afterwards, John Lennon is murdered. It's very early in the 1980s that this album is released, right around January 12th. November 17th, 1980. I apologize, is when it was released. And then the first single was released on January 12th, 1981, shortly after John Lennon's death. So that's a little bit. It was not well regarded at the time, but sort of like many things, it's been retconned to be very well regarded. I'll have my take on why that is, but I've talked a hell of a lot. Josh, I want to hear your take on this one.
Yeah, so my take is that this is a pretty good album. I mean, it's a testament to both of their talent and kind of what they're interested in their unique styles of music. Are both on display here. They, like you said, John Lennon is clearly hearkening back to, I keep saying hearkening back this episode, but he is,
you're hearkening back to when you said it before, Josh.
indebted to the 50s and 60s oldies. And I think he's intentionally trying to kind of create this classic sound, be it from doo-wop or even some slight country, and just kind of these like easily accessible pop sounding songs that maybe have some more complex themes to them, or ideas. And then you have the Yoko Ono side, or contribution to this album. I would say the other side of the coin to this album is that she's definitely more pushing the envelope in terms of being, since this is such early, late 70s, early 80s when they're making it, kind of that post-punk new wave type of sound that we discussed at length on the show. And it fits right in with those sounds. And I found both the idea that the tracks alternate between the two of them, and just kind of getting the alternating styles of music each track was also kind of interesting and pleasing to hear. I also thought it was interesting that they don't really cross over. You would think that they would sing on each other's songs, or contribute, have more of like duets or some sort of contribution in that sense, but it's really like evenly separated and split. And It's a real so that's interesting too. You don't see that too often in terms of like essentially two separate artists being on the
Yeah,
same
it's not like
album.
the Beatles, right, where there were
Right.
Lennon or McCartney songs, but they harmonized famously on both of them. Nope,
Yeah.
these are like this is a John Lennon song and this is a Yoko Ono song.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep, and they're completely their own identities, and you just get two for one essentially on an album, and they're each interested in their own thing. Clearly, there's not like John Lennon doing a post punk song. It's like not that's not the case, or Yoko Ono doing an oldies song. That does not happen on here. So, but I found it, pleasing to listen to. I found it kind of not off-putting, but it caught me off guard that it was so oldies based in some ways. It felt
Me
like
too.
it
Yeah.
felt like what the early Beatles would have been doing, in terms of their blues, their love of the blues, and the early rock, Elvis, and kind of all the early rock stuff that they listened to as boys. And then and Yoko being Yoko, but also being like a pretty good, artist, I would say, and musically interesting songs, things that definitely fit in with kind of all the other post-punk and new wave sounds that we heard. You referenced the B-52s, and I can see that, and it was just as enjoyable to listen to her songs than it would be some of those other artists. So yeah, it's like an interesting experiment, but also just really good pop music and rock music.
Yeah, I was familiar with Just Like Starting Over, right? And like I knew that had sort of a nostalgic 50s, 60s feel to
Yeah.
it. I just figured it was like that was the track where they did that, right?
Right.
And it also, Just Like Starting Over always reminds me a little bit of Instant Karma too, for some reason. I don't know how to describe it, but I just think they have some similarities for my ear. Yeah, I look at this as like two different albums, right? Like
Yeah.
thematically, I think this is sort of like, let's give you a view of our love and our relationship and our family, which,
Yep.
and I'm going to kind of go into like a, thought piece here in a second, but I don't want to do it before we talk about the music first. But that's it. It's also very much like a I'm hitting middle age album for John Lennon, right? Where he's sort of writing, it seems like he's writing just as he is, right? So there's not as much edge, right? The lyrics are at times more trite than you expect. I mean, there's still some gems in here. In terms of he throws in, but for the most part, they're a little bit trite. I don't think lyrics are really Yoko's thing. I don't think that's really what she's going for, right? Like I think the lyrics sort
Yeah, I
of
don't
like
think that's what
many
she's
artists.
interested in.
I think it's just like many artists, right? They're interested in the totality of the piece or the music or the art, right? And the lyrics just happen to be another piece of it, not a primary piece. But yeah, so it sounds like this is like John Lennon playing stuff that reminds him of childhood while it's almost nostalgia, which John Lennon famously like hated when he was more tumultuous, shall we say, right? And it's the sort of like, now that I'm more centered, right? Like I can go back and revisit the things that sort of sparked me at the beginning with the Beatles and my childhood and stuff like that. So you've got these John Lennon songs that are identifiable. And yeah, and it's also clear Yoko's like, I found mainstream / pop music which appeals to me, a la like new wave or sort of the artier world type music on there. And it wouldn't be hard to figure to have Yoko listening to stuff like Public Image Limited and
Right.
Throbbing Gristle. I'm sure there was that also passing through her filter, right, along with the stuff that's a little bit more danceable and mainstream. And I feel like much like John kind of calmed down, I think Yoko also was a little bit less self-conscious about being a serious artist, right, or being taken seriously, and kind of leaned a little bit more into let's make a little bit more accessible music that's, complementary along the way. But I like the difference of both of them. I actually think the Yoko album, part of the album, sounds way more like it could hack it in today's world than the Lennon stuff sounds like, I love the Beatles, right? But it
Right.
sounds like, the John Lennon Beatles sound. Whereas the Yoko stuff sort of like, well, some of this stuff could travel to the modern era that she's doing, and
Yep.
certainly travel a little bit better into the 80s and 90s with where it was going. But it's funny, like I can't necessarily I don't like connect with this idea of like domestic bliss as a theme, but I don't need to connect with something to like it in the way that other people do. And I've always thought like one of the reasons this album was so poorly regarded was that this was just for people that loved the Beatles that were of a certain age.
Right.
They did not want John Lennon to not be John Lennon anymore. And like when he released an album that was appropriate for a 40-year-old guy, like growing into it, like they were like, it doesn't sound enough like the Beatles, and why the hell are you subjecting me to Yoko Ono, who I don't like? So instead of being like she's an integral part of John Lennon's journey, right? And like you don't have to like it, but like if you're still not getting that by 1980, like you're not getting your idol. You know what I mean? It's kind of like what you'd see later with like Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love, right? It's like, well, why is she here? It's like, well, she's integral to like who Kurt Cobain is, so you're gonna have to like process that, right? Because it's a piece of his art, right? And like I do think that when you read the feedback, so many of the people are like, this album, John Lennon's being wasted, by Yoko, and all they're writing about's themselves. It's like, but if music's writing about what you know about, right? It's kind of like that's what you do, right? And this is where he's at right now. And I think listening to it without having all of that subtext of having listened to the Beatles and be around and see the evolution, I don't carry as much of that baggage, so I can kind of like listen to the Yoko stuff like as the stuff, right? And not like, Yoko is a part of this narrative, right? That I, don't like compared to the other stuff. And we've had this talk. Go ahead,
I was going to say that almost like mythical ability or story of like Yoko like somehow breaking up the Beatles, and like that's not true, and I don't know, there's like unnecessary harshness towards her, and like him,
well,
like
we can
her
look at it
somehow,
at
like
modern
influencing
lens.
her in a negative way or something.
Well, it's what rock was. It's like rock was a misogynistic culture, especially rock criticism, right? And like that era was I mean that continues all the way through the 80s, the 90s, even the 00s, right? That you have these male and I know there's going to be some people that are going to be like, look at these guys flying the flag of, modern. And I think I'm a pretty healthy balance of, you know what I mean? Like I like some of the traditional stuff, and I'm not for elements, where traditional, but like it's clear when you're reading this stuff, there's just a lot of hostile men towards women. They don't want them at the show. If they're there, they can be the groupies. Maybe if they have a great voice, they can sing as like a novelty act, you know what I mean? Or they can be in like black music, right? But like not in rock music, right? Like, you know what I mean? And the legacy of rock is all of these people, right? Like having to be defined by either who they're dating or like how the press compares them to male acts, right? Like, and leading up to this, right? Like, whether it be Heart, right? You know what I mean? Or Stevie Nicks and Fleetwood Mac, or Blondie, right? Like all of them, are attractive women. Don't get me wrong, but like they aren't primarily selling their sexuality in the front. You know what I mean? But they get made into these sexualized things by the men, right? Like it's just because that's how they want it, right, to do it. And so you get somebody like Yoko, right, who's giving them none of this shit. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
that's true.
and not only like hostilely challenging them, just sort of like not even acknowledging them, right? Like kind of just existing outside of them, giving them nothing, right? Like no anger, no intrigue, just she offends their sensibilities to some degree, right? And I give John Lennon credit, and I feel like he was very aware of that, right? Like that, and kind of almost, I think, admired her for that. And, you know, in the modern context, I think it's so much easier to understand Yoko Ono and like their relationship coming from 2023 than I guess maybe it was in the late 60s to 1980. And we have the benefit, I guess, of knowledge, but that's how I look at this album. It's just like, you may not have to like it, but this idea that like Yoko Ono spoiled, you know, what John Lennon was, like, if you know anything about John Lennon didn't want to become your nostalgia. He fought against that intensely. You know what I mean? So this idea that she's ruining him from being the real John Lennon means that maybe you need to reevaluate your idol a little bit better, right? So, and so, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was gonna say it must have been, you know, you said at some point this album has been reappraised, and probably the death of John Lennon has had some impact on how people thought of this album after.
Well, of course, there were reviews that were there that were overwhelmingly negative. Then, of course, suddenly they magically got positive afterwards, which they kind of did. But I think really why this album has been reimagined is because, like, for the people that didn't like it, like the idea of Yoko being on it was going to always make it an album they hated, right? So now I think there might be still, and I didn't love all of this album. Right, there were some things that didn't connect as much to me. I thought some of the Lennon songs were really excellent, and some of them not as much. Like I thought a song like Just Like Starting Over and I'm Losing You and Beautiful Boy, like pretty much all the side one Lennon songs were really strong. Now, Woman, I know a lot of people love that song. It didn't do as much to me, and you know, Dear Yoko, not as much, right, of the Lennon stuff. And some of the Yoko stuff hit more for me than the others. The closer it was to new wave, the more I tended to like the Yoko stuff. I'd also like to mention there's like a little bit of like an Asian feel sonically, and not just Yoko, like her slight accent and stuff like that. I'm talking like the music choices have a little bit of like Asian tinge to them as well. When I say Asian, I'm talking like Japanese music sounds. It's not overwhelming. Still overwhelmingly the sound is of like Western new wave or synth or, you know, avant-garde type stuff. But I did catch some things in there where she was putting in a little bit, right, of nods to the culture as well. So yeah.
Oh, we should also, I also like to mention the second track, Kiss Kiss Kiss, and her thinly veiled nod to the female orgasm, I would imagine.
Well, it sounds like she was having an orgasm on the, thinly veiled. That's, thinly veiled in the way that a tombstone is a thinly veiled marker of death. So, there also was one of the Yoko Ono songs that sounded like and I think she ended up getting sued by it. For it. It sounded, is it Yes, I'm an Angel, I think, that basically was exactly making Whoopi. Like, I didn't know what the song was, but I'm like, this song sounds exactly like another song. I'm like, I couldn't figure it out. I'm like, all right, I'm going to cheat. And so I went, right, to research, and immediately they're like, she was sued by the writers of Making Whoopi. I'm like, that's it. That's the song. So, yep. Nice. It's not exactly the same. It's not a direct, but like, there's so much overlap that but it's like one of those things, like if you have overlap but not an exact rewrite, does it exist in the lexicon of, you know, different stuff like that? I didn't think it was so egregious, but I will say though that I noticed that it sounded like something else. So nice. So any final thoughts on this one?
What I'd be interested in doing, and this just popped in my head, is that maybe just listening to the Yoko Ono tracks and like skipping to see how that coheres as like an album or like a piece, as opposed to... you get the idea that you know what the John Lennon album would sound like, right? Because you kind of know what a John Lennon album sounds like. Yep. But yeah, that's a very good point, Josh. I didn't thought of that, but I'd also be interested in hearing the second part of this.
the second album that came out of this, if it's a similar type of theme or if they separated out a specific type of song from this album. Like, is it a different lyrical content? Does it sound different? You know what I mean? Is it less influenced by, new wave or 50s and 60s rock? I'd be curious. So I might, while we have a little time, listen to that.
Are you talking about?
Well, remember I said that they recorded two whole albums worth of tracks on this one. Like, this was the first piece. They then took a second thing called Milk and Honey, right?
Oh.
Which was, this was after posthumous. They released it. It was how it's described here is it was released in January 1984, 3 years after Lennon's murder. It was the first posthumous release of Lennon music, and most of it was recorded during these. In fact, pretty much all of it was recorded during these sessions.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So yeah, it's completely
There's also,
new.
interestingly, a song called "Nobody Told Me," which was a song that Lennon had written and wanted to gift to Ringo Starr. That is on this album as well. So I don't know if like Ringo himself sings it or if like John Lennon sang it but was planning on. It looks like, I'm looking at the thing. It looks like it says Lennon, like as the writer. So I don't know. I'd have to listen to it. I'd be curious. So
there's also a stripped down version of this album that they redid. I'm seeing that was done. I think Yoko did it, and so I guess it's like a stripped down mix, apparently, of all the songs. That whole album's on Amazon Music as well.
Okay. And I guess part of why it took so long for it to come out was that Douglas and Yoko Ono, I guess, had a falling out a little bit about royalties. And so it took a long time for them to agree on stuff, he and Jack Douglas. So, yep.
Okay.
So, yeah, I would say, pretty comfortable thumbs up for me on this one. Do I like it as much as the two pure Lennon solo albums? I don't know if I do. But I liked Plastic Ono Band a whole lot. And I liked a fair amount of Imagine as well. This one's a little bit more breezy and easy to get into, but I don't know if it has the replayability for me of those two albums.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I remember liking Plastic Ono Band a lot and being surprised by that in a good way. And but this is still quality. It's testament to both of their abilities as artists to make good records.